Okay, everybody, it is time for my review of this week's episode of Dark Side of the Ring. But before I get into that, quick video update. On the non-wrestling side of things, my top 20 Thundercats episode video is almost done. I should finish it up this weekend. So a little ahead of schedule where I originally wanted, when I originally wanted to have it done. So that's good. I guess quarantine has just been giving me a lot of free time, so it gives me more time to edit. One decision that I have to make, though, is whether or not to split the video up into two parts, because it did end up being pretty long, longer than the He-Man video. Why is that? I think it's because of quarantine, and I had too much time on my hands, and I said, I got a little self-indulgent. That's probably what happened. So, I think without the parts that still need to be edited into it, it's at this point like an hour 10, hour 15. And you add those parts in, they'll probably extend it to, I don't know, probably around an hour 20 by the time it's done. So we're looking at a pretty long video here, and I'm like, I don't know if I should release a video about Thundercats that's that long, kind of unnecessary. So maybe if I split it up into two parts, it'll be more manageable. But then again, when I did my Godzilla movie reviews, I did them all in one go, and they ended up being like 2-hour-long videos, so who knows. But that's a game day decision. We'll find out next week after the video is done. So that is that. But now it's time to talk about Dark Side of the Ring, the David Schultz episode, specifically focusing on the incident between David Schultz and John Stossel for ABC, and that famous the slap heard round the world. It's what David Schultz is most known for. John Stossel even admitted himself that of all the stuff he's done, that's one of the most viewed, or one of the things he gets asked about the most, is the slap from David Schultz. And I'm just going to go out and say it right now. I think of all the episodes they've done for Season 2 so far, even Season 1, we'll count the episodes of Season 1 into what I'm about to say, I think this might be the best episode they've done so far. And the story all the way through was engaging, and I think what really helped this one was that you got all the different viewpoints. You had Jim Cornette, who was kind of the historian, who was able to provide context for who all these people were. You had John Stossel interviewed as part of it, which props to him for being willing to talk about this and be up for doing this and kind of complete the story. Because one of the criticisms against Dark Side of the Ring is that they don't always get all the viewpoints. And that's not for lack of trying. They tried to get Kevin Sullivan on the Benoit one, but couldn't. He turned him down. There were a few times where I would have liked a WWE representative of some kind to be on some of these episodes just to get that viewpoint on there, but they're probably not allowed to. Jim Ross kind of had to be the de facto WWE guy on the Benoit special because probably no one else... I guarantee you, Vince put the hammer down and said no one is appearing on that Benoit thing. Nobody under contract with me is appearing on that thing. So it was nice to get David Schultz, John Stossel, and even Eddie Mansfield, who was part of the expose as well. So with all of that, we were able to get all the opposing viewpoints and all the different sides of the story. Again, not having Vince, it would have been nice to have Vince. It would have been nice to have Hulk Hogan there. But all in all, I felt like all the different viewpoints were represented about as well as they could possibly be for this thing. And what I really, really liked about it was that it wasn't so much about the slap incident. They kind of used it to focus on the larger narrative, which was the death of kayfabe. And going from the kind of carny days of having to protect the business and making sure that people thought, made sure that people thought it was real, to the sports entertainment era where Vince kind of pulled the curtain back and said, nope, we're entertainment and we're here to make the kids laugh, and I'm here to be the Walt Disney of sports entertainment, can't say wrestling, and so on and so forth. And this incident played a really big part in that evolution from Death of Kayfabe to what we have today. And I think tackling that angle was very interesting, and I was really impressed with the amount of research that they did and all the different things that they were able to cover throughout the course of the episode. And I guess I'll elaborate on my feelings on the incident and of David Schultz. like I said with Dino Bravo, whose best days were a little before my time, and like I said about Jimmy Snuka, whose best days were a little bit before my time, David Schultz was one of those guys that was a little before my time. Like, I missed him by a few years. But I remember the first time I saw him in a video. I was about 12 or 13. The Attitude Era had kind of started by this point, and I'd started collecting like old WWF videotapes from like the 80s, like the early, like pre-WrestleMania, but during the Hogan era when it was still had like a blood and guts element to it, before it had gone full on sports entertainment. And David Schultz was one of the guys that was featured on some of the tapes that I got. And I was like, who is this guy? He's great. I saw his promos, and I saw some of his matches. I saw one of his matches with Hogan on one of the tapes that I saw. And I was like, I really like this guy. I mean, this guy is awesome. And, you know, and I said it last week, he was Stone Cold Steve Austin before there was Stone Cold Steve Austin. He was Attitude before there was Attitude. He was this over-the-top redneck guy that was as real could be. Legitimate, tough-looking guy. You wouldn't want to cross him. John Stossel found out the hard way what happens when you cross David Schultz. And I was really impressed with him and what I saw. I'm not going to say that he became one of my favorite wrestlers, but whenever I got a new tape and he was on it, I was like, fuck yeah, I get to watch a David Schultz match. And because I was that impressed with him, and he's one of those guys that it's really unfortunate that he got basically blacklisted from pro wrestling over what happened, because I feel like he got cheated out of what should have been a Hall of Fame career, because I think he had the talent and the character to do that. And I think the fans got cheated out of someone really, really special. I think he could have been like a superstar on a big main event level. And Cornette kind of alludes to, like, he probably would have left the WWE as it got more and more cartoony. But he would have easily found a job in Crockett. I mean, if he had left New York without any controversy, Crockett, I'm sure he could have gone there and made money. And he probably could have been a mainstay in WCW in the 90s as well. So I felt like there was a lot more to his wrestling career that could have been mined. And he's one of those, like, what could have been type of stories. And I was really glad that they focused on his work with Hogan. And that whole relationship was really interesting, because they talked about how he and Hogan were friends and Hogan helped bring him in. And then after all the shit hit the fan, Hogan kind of distanced himself from David Schultz, and they had a falling out. And what it kind of reminded me of, for those of you that are fans of BoJack Horseman, and that great show, if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. It's on Netflix. Just wrapped up its last season back in January, so go check it out. I highly recommend it. In season 1, we find out that there was a producer on this actor BoJack Horseman show, and yes, he's a talking horse, but watch the show, you'll understand it more. There was this producer who was like his best friend, and they developed the show together, and as BoJack became a bigger star, and the producer had a falling out with the studio, with the network, BoJack had to make a choice. It's like, all right, do I side with my friend, or do I side with the network? And he ultimately sided with Fame and Fortune, and kind of left him high and dry. It left his friend high and dry. And I was kind of getting that same vibe here. And that's one of the reasons it would have been nice to have Hogan's take on it, beyond just a line from the Stone Cold podcast that he did. Because I wonder if there was like, Hogan was like, oh, we can't be friends anymore because I'm like the most famous guy in wrestling, and I can't have you sully my name or whatever or anything like that. So there's probably more to tell as far as the relationship between Hogan and David Schultz. But as it was being laid out, that was immediately the picture I had in my head, was BoJack and Herb from that show. And so I guess I'll go into the slap incident. And again, what I loved about this whole thing was that this episode was really about the death of kayfabe more than anything else. And you get that incident where, in his mind, raised the old school way, which, by the way, his training sounded absolutely horrible, David Schultz's training, working with guys that rub shit under their armpits so that when they had them in their headlock, they'd be smelling the shit. I'm like, could you imagine that happening today? I mean, there'd be lawsuits up the ass if that happened today. But back then, again, it was very different. It was about protecting the business and making sure that the right guys and talents got into the business and not guys just looking to make money. It was guys who were really serious and wanted to protect the integrity of the industry. And so I almost understand that kind of wild, wild west mentality that they had back then. And that's how David Schultz was brought up. And really, ultimately, what he did, he was just doing probably an extreme version of what many other guys before him, and even a little bit during that time, were expected to do. I'd heard stories about Road Warrior Hawk would go into a bar, and if anybody called him a phony, he would give them worked punches just to see if they could take it. And more often than not, they couldn't take it. Although I'm sure he says worked punches. I'm like, I don't know. Hawk's a tough dude. I'm like, he's another one of those guys I wouldn't want to mess with. It's like, again, if they had done the Brawl for All in the 80s, Road Warrior Hawk would have fit in perfectly. David Schultz would have fit in perfectly. Haku probably would have won the whole thing. Jake Roberts had a great line once where he said, wrestling's not about who the toughest guy is. If it was about the toughest guy, there'd only be two people left, Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Haku. Everybody else would have gotten the hell out. So, again, it speaks to the different kind of talents that were around back in that time period as opposed to today, where, again, I was trying to think of who would be in the Brawl for All today, and the only one I came up with in the video was Brock, and somebody in the comments section suggested Matt Riddle. I'm like, yes, Matt Riddle, absolutely. Other than that, I don't know. It's hard to say. But anyway, the slap incident happened with John Stossel doing his investigative reporting on pro wrestling. He was going to do the whole expose and the whole 9 yards. I wonder, he would probably say he'd never been treated like that before in any reporting job, or, journalistic assignment he'd ever had in his entire life. And it is a very shocking moment to see a reporter get slapped across the face by one of the heels. I would actually, if I were watching it back then, I would have thought it was part of the show. Like, I would have thought like he and the reporter put this together to do this thing to get heat on David Schultz. And it was very interesting that when he went over to Japan while things cooled down, which that was interesting because I thought he was let go from WWE immediately after that incident. I thought that was like the end of it, but no, he actually got sent to Japan for a little bit to kind of wait for things to cool down, and Japan turned it into his gimmick where he beat up reporters, which is hilarious. And then it was an incident with Mr. T later on, leading into the first WrestleMania, that led to his departure, and there are conflicting reports on what happened there. Hogan says that he slapped T across the face. David Schultz says that didn't happen. It was just a bit of awkwardness going on with T there. Didn't really like having T there because he's an actor and yada, 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 all this other stuff. That old school mindset of, we got to protect the business. Why are we letting actors into the business? All that other stuff. But it's, as for the slap itself, there's a big part of me that really does feel sorry for David Schultz, because again, he was too old school for his own good, and he was really only doing what at that time, and the way he had been trained and brought up in the business, he was doing what he felt he would have been expected to do. And it also helps that and that's another thing. What the hell was Vince McMahon thinking, lining up Iron Sheik and Iron Sheik, he's a kook, but he's not necessarily dangerous. And David Schultz to interview the reporter. You would think that they would be like that episode of The Simpsons where Principal Skinner locks Bart and all the bullies in that room so that they're nowhere around while the school's being inspected. You would think that Vince would have done something like that with some of the rowdier boys. And David Schultz just being put out there. It was almost like a recipe for disaster right there. And he was just doing what he felt was expected of him. And I kind of feel sorry for him that he was kind of, he hadn't changed with the times. Why should he change with the times? It is what he had been doing the entire time he'd been in pro wrestling. And now that he's done it to a reporter, it's causing problems. And there are more eyeballs on the WWF at the time than there had been in the history of professional wrestling. So it was that kind of magnified the severity of what had happened. And I also, by the way, I also thought it was great that they brought up the Richard Belzer Hulk Hogan moment, but that was an accident. That was the reason Hulk didn't get in trouble for that is because it was an accident. Clearly, I don't think Hulk clearly didn't intend to knock the dude out, but he did, and it's one of the scariest things I've ever seen in an interview. But I would say it's probably scarier than the Stossel slap, but it was clearly an accident. So no heat on Hogan for an accident, but. John Stossel, who was on the thing, again, I give him credit for being part of this and talking about it and kind of giving his side of the story of what happened. I still felt like he came across like an asshole in this, and maybe it's not so much my love of wrestling that's clouding me, it's my hatred of the news media. I hate the news media, and I felt this way for a very, very long time. I think a lot of journalists are sensationalist, crazy, manipulative assholes that will twist the truth to push a narrative just to excite, entertain. I mean, they really do use a lot of the same tactics as, like, sensationalist tactics that I would expect to see in pro wrestling, where it's like they got to make it sound as bad as humanly possible to get people interested in seeing it. Again, you think I'm crazy. I mean, go back and look at the coverage of the Benoit situation and how that was handled, how horribly that was handled, all around. And I'm not saying this as somebody who's defending Chris Benoit. I'm not. I'm just saying the coverage was downright shameful because there were mistruths that were pushed. There were the way they ran with it and the way they covered it and the way they just sensationalized the holy hell out of it. It just looked like a witch hunt, a flavor of the month witch hunt, which is what the news media does, where it's like, okay, do you really care, or are you just pursuing this because it's hot right now, and then when the next thing comes around, you're going to go jump on that thing like it's, like, like that's the most important, horrible thing that's going on in the world right now. So, I don't like the news media. And Stossel, to me, kind of came across like an asshole. Like he said, I felt compelled to do this because I felt people were being lied to, that they thought this was real. There was a poll that said, that interviewed the audience and said that 1/3 of the people there thought it was real. And I'm like, wait a minute. So even back then in the mid-'80s, a majority of the audience knew it wasn't real. And how many of that 1/3 are kids or parents of kids just playing up for their kids? Like, you really felt the need to expose the business that a majority of people already knew wasn't real. To me, I wish wrestling had gotten to a point where it was treated like magic shows, where... And I know they've done exposition on magic shows, showing how the tricks are done. It's like, look, I know that there's no magic involved. I know that it's a trick. I absolutely know it's a trick. I saw a magician back in college who said very upfront at the beginning of the show, I have no magical powers. None of these are real. They are called tricks for a reason. Any one of you could do these tricks with 10 to 15 years of training. And I wish that that same mindset had been kind of adapted for pro wrestling, where it's like, yes, we know it's not real, but I do not want to know how it's done. I want to sit there and enjoy the entertainment, and I want to I want to preserve the mystery of it. There were so many things about pro wrestling nowadays that I wish I didn't know. One secret I kept for myself for the longest time, I never knew where they hid the razor blades for blading, and I never wanted to know. Somebody finally told me, and I was like, it was just one of those things I was willfully ignorant about. It's like, I don't want to know. I know they blade, I don't know where they hide it, and I don't know how they get a hold of it, and it turns out there's multiple different ways to do it, but still, it was, I wish we could have that mystery back about it. I wish, like, we could exist in a world where we all know it's not real, but we're all entertained by it, and we don't want to have the secrets revealed. And I don't want to know how any of this is done. I just want to sit there and enjoy it. And so him, like, doing the expose with Eddie Mansfield, Eddie Mansfield, he struck me as a guy that had sour grapes against a promoter and just wanted to stick it to him. Because, again, it's like the whole, like, oh, I did this for the boys. I'm like, okay, if you were doing it for the boys, you would have gone after the promoter. You wouldn't have exposed all the secrets and how things are done in the ring. Because that hurts the boys, because now they just look like a bunch of frauds, and everybody knows how to do it, so now, it's going to be seen as, like, not that big of a deal or whatever. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just assuming the worst of people. But Stossel, like, I don't know, he really rubbed me the wrong way. I thought he was kind of a dick. Again, that's not because of my love of wrestling. It's because of the fact that I just hate the news media and most news outlets. It's almost comforting to know that, oh, they were shitty even back in the 80s. That's great. It's great. So this is not a new thing either. Like, the news media that you see today, it's something that's been steadily getting worse over the course of the last few decades. Probably since the invention of television, but, that's neither here nor there. But anyway, I don't necessarily agree with David Schultz slapping him. I think that was a distinct tactical error on his part. But David Schultz sounds like a pretty rigid, inflappable guy, and he is what he is, which made him great for pro wrestling. Maybe a bad on interviews, and you shouldn't be sending him out there to be interviewed by people. But nonetheless, it's a shame that incident kind of ruined his career. It absolutely is a shame, because, like I said, I feel like he could have been a Hall of Fame talent, and he was, I stand by it. He was Stone Cold before you knew who Stone Cold was, and he was Attitude before there was Attitude. He was one of those guys, and he fit the pro wrestling business like a glove. He was absolutely great, and I just wish we had gotten more of him. And we could have seen how far he could have really gone. It makes you wonder, like, could he and Hogan have been the main event of WrestleMania 2 if they had decided to do that? I don't know. We'll never know. It is what it is, unfortunately. But I will say this, ending it with David Schultz's post-wrestling life, where he became a bounty hunter, that's a movie I'd love to see. The wrestler turned bounty hunter, and David Schultz being the most badass motherfucker on the planet and, doing that job for a living. That was awesome. And that's, again, I didn't know any of that about David Schultz. So to get that aspect of his life covered as well, I was like, that's pretty insane and cool and all this other stuff. And, well, it's nice to know that he found something to do after wrestling. And he seems like he's doing okay, like, nowadays. He works, he lives his life, and, we had fun being a bounty hunter and beating people up and bringing people in and all that other fun stuff. So, I mean, that one line that really stood with me, I don't remember the exact wordage of it, but it was like, they sent me in after this guy. Nobody wanted to bring him in because he was a really bad guy, and they were kind of scared of him. So I went in there, I stuck a 9mm in his mouth. He wasn't so bad. I was like, Jesus Christ. The life of a bounty hunter. It's like, we've seen things on TV like Dog the Bounty Hunter, but it's like, I think we underestimate just how crazy the life of a bounty hunter really is. And there's probably a great movie or a documentary to be made there about that type of stuff. If there hasn't been already, and I just don't know about it. I don't know. But in any case, I thought this week's episode of Dark Side of the Ring was absolutely fantastic across the board. I think it's the best work that they've produced, at least for Season 2. I would even say in the entire show's run. I absolutely loved it. The topic was interesting. The subject, David Schultz, it's nice to see more eyeballs brought to him. Even if it is just reliving the most infamous moment of his career, I think people, kind of like what the New Jack episode did for me, where it exposed me to his Smoky Mountain stuff, I think people who weren't familiar with his actual body of work in wrestling got to see his snippets of his stuff with Hogan. And I maintain it. It's like, look, if you want an idea of what Austin versus Hogan may have looked like, that's probably the best indicator that's out there, Hogan's work with David Schultz. And they had some pretty good brawling bloodbaths back in the day. So I like that more people were exposed to David Schultz, and hopefully people will go out and check out his work. Because like I said, I feel like he was we missed the boat on someone special. And so yeah, the topic is interesting. The subject is interesting. It went a couple of places I didn't expect it to go, and it had this interesting overarching narrative about the death of kayfabe, which is really what it was about. And because not long after that incident where David Schultz had to protect the business, Vince started to pull the curtain back and say, no, we're entertainment, and yada, yada, yada. And by the way, the shot of that press conference that they showed, to see Undertaker in full garb in like 97 standing there with Vince McMahon and all the other suits is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. But it was still like it indicates like what was going on, and how kayfabe pretty much had died, and they pretty much acknowledged wrestling's entertainment. And unfortunately, poor David Schultz had to be one of the victims in that evolution process, where he was still knees deep in that old school mindset of protecting the business, and just a few short years later that would become moot and pointless. And it is what it is. But in any case, I thought this week's episode was excellent. I absolutely loved it. It's their best work of season 2. And I'm really looking forward to next week's episode, because again, it's kind of a rare one. Herb Abrams and the UWF. I think there's a very interesting story to be told there. I don't know a lot about the UWF. I've seen bits and pieces of it. I know bits and pieces of the history. So if they do half as good with that as they did with this one, I think we're in for a hell of a show next week. But that is all I have for you now. Thanks again, everybody, for watching. Be sure to follow me on Twitter. The link is in the description. And be sure to like, subscribe, comment down below, and hit the little bell icon so you get notified when I post new videos. But that is all I have for you now. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and I will see you later.